or focus.
And the wearable tech we just talked about, the smartwatches and things they fit here too.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely. While they're not modifying your biology directly, they are essential tools for the data collection part that drives a lot of biohacking efforts, helping people track fitness, health metrics, even reproductive cycles to, inform their strategies.
Okay, so moving down that spectrum now, things get more complex, potentially riskier. The sources talk about using prescription medications.
Right, and this is where the conversation shifts significantly. The sources discuss medications like methylphenidate, which you might know as Ritalin,
Yeah.
Adderall, or even Memantine, which is sometimes used for Alzheimer's. These are drugs prescribed by doctors for specific medical conditions.
But some people are using them off-label for enhancement.
Yes, precisely that. The courses highlight that these are sometimes misused by individuals who are looking for enhanced cognitive performance, but for non-medical reasons.
And I bet the research is pretty clear about the dangers of doing that.
It is. It's a critical point the sources really emphasize. Taking prescription stimulants when you don't have the condition they're meant for comes with a much higher risk of serious negative outcomes.
Like what?
Things like increased anxiety, a higher likelihood of using other drugs, developing conditions like PTSD, and kind of paradoxically, sometimes even worse academic performance. The absolute key takeaway here, stressed in the material, is these medications should only be taken under the strict guidance of a medical professional. Period.
That's a really stark warning. Okay, what's even further out on that experimental edge of the spectrum then?
So the sources describe implanted devices as potentially the next frontier, kind of the next step from the wearables we have now.
Devices under the skin.
Yeah, inserted under the skin. The idea is they could collect even more precise biological data, or maybe in some visions, potentially even perform modifications within the body.
Okay, that's definitely heading towards sci-fi territory for some.
It is for many, yeah.
So within this wide spectrum, the sources also seem to categorize different approaches or maybe types. They mentioned 3 popular ones.
Yes, the material points to 3 distinct areas that people often focus on: DIY biology, nutrigenomics, and grinders.
Tell us about DIY biology first. That's sometimes called garage biology.
That's right. This is characterized as a movement where people with expertise in scientific fields, maybe researchers, maybe technicians, share their knowledge and techniques with those who don't have formal training or access to traditional labs.
So it's about enabling experiments outside the usual institutions.
Exactly. It's about doing experiments and research outside constrained environments.
And is there like a philosophy behind it?
There often is, yeah. Some participants see it as a kind of open revolution against what they perceive as the academic institutionalization of science, promoting citizen science, action research without rigid gatekeeping.
So the claimed benefits are things like more ideas, more freedom.
More inclusivity, improvisation.
Yeah.
It's quite broad, too, touching on areas like microbiology, nutrition science, even aspects of biomedical or synthetic biology.
Okay, that makes sense. Then nutrigenomics. That sounds very specific, nutrition and genetics.
That's exactly what it is. This type of biohacking focuses really tightly on the intricate relationship between the food you eat and your personal genes. Well, it looks at how your diet affects your gene expression, how your genes are turned on or off, and also how your specific genetic makeup influences your body's unique response to different foods.
And what's the goal there? What can you do with that information?
The hope, the potential application, is to use this understanding to maybe assess individual health risks based on genetic predispositions and potentially find new ways to prevent or treat diseases through really personalized nutrition.
How does that work in practice?
Well, the process often involves analyzing a person's DNA sample, spin in a tube sort of thing, to then develop a diet plan that's supposedly optimized for their genetic profile, maybe advising them to avoid certain foods their genes suggest they might react poorly to.
There was even that fascinating animal study related to this mentioned, wasn't there?
Yes, the sources do mention an animal study that used a nutrigenomic approach, and it found that consuming fructose, a type of sugar, actually remodeled significant aspects of gene regulation.
Affecting what?
Affecting things like how infections might progress, changes in metabolism, inflammation levels, immune function. It really shows the deep biological impact diet can have at a genetic level.
Oh, okay. And the third category, the grinders. What's that about?
The grinders are described as biohackers, who are particularly focused on the idea of human augmentation. They often see themselves as pioneers in that space.
So physically integrating technology with the body.
Precisely. This type is most associated with those implanted devices we mentioned earlier, and generally using technology to modify the human body in a more fundamental way than just, say, tracking data with a watch.
All right, so we've got this spectrum, these different approaches, nutrigenomics, DIY bio, grinders. The big question, I suppose, is, does any of this actually work? Is there solid evidence behind these biohacks?
Yeah, that's where it gets really tricky to give a single, simple answer for the whole field. As the sources point out, assessing the overall success is incredibly difficult.
Why is that?
Well, there's a serious lack of regulation and standardized reporting. When people share their DIY experiments online, on blogs, forums, whatever, verifying the accuracy of their methods or the validity of their results is practically impossible.
Okay, so lots of anecdotal stuff, maybe. But are there some practices associated with biohacking that do have research behind them?
Oh, they absolutely do. The sources are clear to highlight methods where there is peer-reviewed research suggesting potential benefits. Intermittent fasting is a key one.
We mentioned that earlier.
Right, eating only within specific time windows. Studies have linked that to potential benefits like reducing body fat, lowering blood pressure, heart rate, inflammation, and even increasing the body's resistance to heart stress and diabetes.
Okay, that's interesting. Cold water therapy is another one that seems to get a lot of attention lately.
It has, yeah. This involves immersing yourself in water below about 59 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 Celsius. So open water swimming or ice baths.
That research.
A 2020 review mentioned in the sources suggested there could be positive effects on the cardiovascular system, the immune system, the endocrine system, and potentially mental health markers too.
I know the sources also immediately flag the serious risks here. This isn't something to just jump into, right?
Absolutely critical point. Right alongside any potential benefits, the sources issue a very clear warning about the real dangers. These include cold shock, that dangerous involuntary gasp reflex,
Right.
hypothermia, obviously, and in extreme cases, even sudden death. If someone is interested in trying this, the advice is crystal clear. Seek professional guidance and acclimatize gradually under supervision. Don't just jump in an ice bath.
Okay, good warning. And bringing it back to the everyday, caffeine also gets mentioned again in this context.
It does, and we generally know caffeine can potentially boost alertness,
Yes.
productivity, focus. That's why many of us use it. However,
There's always a how.
there usually is. The sources are quick to add the important caution. Use it in moderation. Overdoing caffeine can lead to unwanted side effects like increased blood pressure, heartburn, headaches, anxiety, the usual suspects.
So it seems like there are some practices with actual evidence, often things that are ancient or well studied, like fasting or caffeine use, that just get grouped under this big biohacking umbrella.
That seems to be the case for some things, yes.
But then there's this other vast landscape of unregulated experimentation.
That's really the key insight the sources drive home. Ethicists and scholars express significant concern about the lack of regulation and accountability in much of the biohacking world, especially when you compare it to traditional scientific or medical research.
Which has ethics boards, strict protocols.
Exactly. All that oversight is often missing in DIY biohacking.
So what are the specific risks they're worried about, beyond the individual hacks themselves?
They detail several dangers. Many biohackers are performing experiments without any kind of ethical review, which is standard practice or requirement in traditional research.
Okay.
They might be working in private settings, garages, kitchens, community spaces that aren't properly equipped or safe for handling biological materials or certain chemicals. Safety measures can be inconsistent, which increases the risk of contamination, illness, or injury.
And beyond the sort of lab work, there's just the risk of bad information floating around, right?
That's a huge risk, yes.
Yeah.
Relying on unofficial health advice you get from blogs or social media or online forums, often from people who aren't accredited medical professionals or registered nutritionists. That's really dangerous.
So the advice is,
The sources strongly urge anyone considering a new diet, supplement regime, any health regimen really, to consult a doctor or a registered nutritionist first. Get proper medical advice.
makes sense. What about the legal side of things? Is biohacking even legal? Can you get in trouble for this?
Generally speaking, the simple health and nutrition biohacks like changing your diet or using wearables aren't against the law. But again, you need to be incredibly conscious about where you're getting your advice.
But for the more complex stuff.
The regulatory landscape, particularly in the U.S., is described in the sources as having pretty unclear legal boundaries for DIY biohacking and experiments done at home. Many of these activities aren't specifically regulated, or maybe the regulations exist but aren't strictly enforced in these contexts.
So like genetic engineering at home?
Well, There are apparently no specific U.S. laws regulating genetic engineering experiments on humans, unless they're happening within a formal clinical setting. Academic institutions mostly rely on self-governance, internal review boards for ethically complex projects.
Are there specific cases mentioned where DIY biohacking is definitely illegal?
Yes, there are a few concrete examples in the sources. Using a specific type of bacteria called agrobacterium to genetically engineer plants that's regulated by the USDA, so doing it outside approved settings is illegal.
Okay.
Also, culturing certain soil bacteria is cited as potentially illegal because soil can contain dangerous pathogens like the bacteria that eats anthrax.
Right, you don't want that in your kitchen sink.
Definitely not. And it's worth noting some countries, like Germany as mentioned, have much stricter licensing requirements for performing certain biohacks than the U.S. might.
So it's a bit of a gray area legally, depending on exactly what you're doing and where you are in the world. How does biohacking relate to, say, traditional biotechnology? Are they the same thing?
Not quite, no. The sources make a point to clarify the distinction. Biotechnology is the broader field that uses living cells or organisms to develop products or services. Think fermentation for making bread or brewing beer, or developing new medicines using biological processes.
Okay.
Biohackers might use techniques or concepts borrowed from biotechnology, but biohacking itself is more about that individual DIY approach to personal biology. It's not necessarily focused on developing commercial products or services in the same way.
Got it. We mentioned earlier that extending lifespan is one of the motivations for some biohackers. How does this field connect with efforts to slow or even reverse aging?
This is definitely another area where there's significant overlap. Some biohacking practices fall squarely into the realm of promoting longevity or uh, health span.
Like what?
Well, the sources connect practices related to nutrigenomics, things we've discussed like maintaining a healthy diet, maybe taking certain supplements, getting regular exercise, practicing meditation. These are often framed as methods aimed at extending a person's natural biological lifespan, keeping them healthy for longer.
Okay, that sounds fairly grounded. What about the more experimental, maybe futuristic sounding approaches to aging that sometimes get talked about?
The sources also touch on those more experimental practices that are sometimes discussed in this context, though it's important to say they are far less common and much more controversial.
Such as?
Things like certain types of blood transfusions, the young blood stuff you hear about, sometimes approaches to egg rejuvenation in women, cryogenics, preserving bodies at very low temperatures.
Hoping to revive them later.
Right. And even gene editing techniques, specifically aimed at slowing down biological aging processes.
And as these ideas, even just the discussion around them, become more prevalent.
Exactly. The sources point out they raise really significant ethical questions. What does it mean for society if people can effectively get older without aging? Are there gendered implications to that? Who gets access?
The access issue seems huge.
It really is. Who will actually have access to these potential life extension technologies, assuming they work? Could it create even greater inequality between those who can afford it and those who can't? Big questions.
Absolutely. Now, it's not just the practices themselves, but the whole movement behind them that's interesting. The sources also trace the history of DIY biology. How did this all start?
Yeah, that historical perspective, particularly looking at the analysis of online discussions, is really revealing. Apparently, terms like garage biology were floating around even before the main DIY Bio online forum launched back in 2008.
So the idea was already percolating.
Seems like it. And that forum, when it launched, sounds like it became a really central hub.
A meeting place.
Yeah, described as a crucial meeting place where people could share knowledge, especially technical stuff like molecular biology techniques, exchange information about tools, find other people with similar interests. The whole vibe was meant to be about openness and accessibility.
Sharing protocols, documenting experiments.
Finding and sharing protocols, document the experiments, developing new methods together. Yeah.
So did it start really small and local?
Very much so, according to the analysis.
Right,
It began very localized, apparently centered around just one city. Initially, Boston is mentioned, with early gatherings happening in really unconventional places like a pub.
From a pub to a global movement.
Pretty much. From there, it grew significantly, becoming this transnational movement. The sources note there are now over 100 DIY biogroups around the world, many of which have established actual physical community lab spaces.
That's quite the evolution, and the sources highlight a specific turning point in its history, a shift.
They do. They identify a key shift happening around 2013-2014. At this time, the movement apparently became more organized, both geographically and economically.
What else changed?
Interestingly, traffic on that main online forum decreased, which might suggest